Now let's take a look at the 36th President of the United States, Richard Nixon. Again, we have 5 criteria we look at as our benchmarks: growth, finances, international politics, war and security, and did they leave the country better or worse, that being the most important one. Before we get started, I think I want to deal with an opinion that I have that might not be popular, but I think it's true, and I will make my argument as I go forward. Watergate wasn't that big of a scandal. It was less of a scandal, I think, than even things that happened earlier in the Nixon administration, and certainly less in terms of what actually it was about than it happened to many presidents before and many presidents we have later. Watergate took down Nixon because Nixon was a completely incompetent president who was an utter failure. His economy was doing horribly. His international planning and politics at that point with regards to Vietnam, which was the central issue in discussion, we can get to the other stuff later when we will, was demonstrating that he was all show and no go. He was doing a horrible job and he was unpopular, and because of that, he was not able to be saved from a scandal, even a scandal as meek as Watergate. Watergate was not great, but Nixon won 60% of the vote. It didn't change the election. It was not a positive thing. It's an example of one of the many things that Nixon did that was corrupt and bad. But many presidents we've had do corrupt and bad things, and we've discussed them as we go through, and they didn't get removed from office. Nixon was removed from office because people didn't want him to be president anymore, and no one was coming to his defense, and it was a good reason to get rid of him. And the discussion around, oh, Watergate took down Nixon, I think misses the fact that Nixon's incompetence took down Nixon. Nixon being a bad president took down Nixon. And I think that narrative being lost sometimes gives Nixon more of a pass than he deserves for the quality of his presidency because we're fixated on his corruption. His policies were bad and they had bad outcomes. So saying that, let's get to what I'm talking about. In terms of growth, when Nixon took office, inflation was relatively high. It was at 4.7%, I believe, which was relatively high. I think it was the highest since post-war. I want to make clear that he did not inherit a perfect economy. He did, however, inherit an economy that was in a budget surplus. In 1969, LBJ's budget, even with the Vietnam War at full speed, was a surplus. Unemployment was at 3.5%. He inherited a good economy with a slight inflation problem. In 1974, his last year in office, inflation got up to 12%, from 4.7% to 12% in his last year in office. We have been discussing in this country under Biden very high inflation that was crippling, that had gotten there for a couple of years after COVID, which we're probably not going to get to because we're not going to get to anyone within 20 years. But inflation had gone up for many reasons. I think one of the reasons it went up is everybody got a check in the mail, and that give free money and inflation happens. But we'll put that aside and we'll just move forward and not discuss modern politics. But it was at 12%, a remarkably high rate, significantly higher than it was under any term since. And in addition to that, generally speaking, when inflation's high, it's because the economy is charging forward. What the Fed tries to do is, when unemployment is high, they lower interest rates. So employers will borrow money to do construction, to have more business, and lower unemployment. And when inflation is high, they raise interest rates so that there's less money circulating in the economy, and that tends to increase unemployment. Unemployment also went up. Unemployment went up to 5.6% in the same year that Nixon left office. So inflation had more than doubled. Unemployment had not doubled, but had gone up by a significant amount. I would say my math is probably bad. My math is bad, but like 60, 70%, it seems like, just doing my quick head math. That's pretty bad. And all of that happened very quickly and because of what I would describe as Nixon shock. And I'm not me describing it. Nixon shock is a term that people use to describe Nixon's decisions. One of the ones people focus most on is removing the United States from the gold standard. And I do think that was part of why the inflation went up. But he also implemented some price controls. He implemented a lot of weird, I wouldn't call it tariffs, but in his tariffs, he did a lot of economic micromanaging. I think in large part to make sure the economy was good going into the election in 1972, which he won in a landslide. Another thing people don't talk about was Nixon was very popular in his reelection. He was able to convince people to vote for him, in part because he's told people exactly what they wanted to hear. even some horrible things that people wanted to hear. We'll get to the Southern strategy later. But by doing all of that, it was all short-term rev for long-term collapse. We were still suffering from the decisions that Nixon made a decade later, well into Reagan. We were still suffering from the stagflation and economic turmoil brought by Richard Nixon's decisions. So in terms of growth, no, I'm not going to give a particularly good review on that. There were some things that he did during his administration that weren't bad. I think the Environmental Protection Agency was very good. Him creating that was good. DEA is established. I think that's more of a mixed bag, but I think the intention is fine. OSHA passed during his administration. The voting age was lowered to 18. He passed the 26th Amendment. These are positive things. I don't want to make it sound like Nixon did no positive things. We put a man on the moon, although, probably a lot of the planning came before Nixon got there, but we did put the man on the moon. I don't want to just say everything he did was bad, Nixon bad, Nixon bad. I want to be fair to him. But no, I do think it's fair to point out that he did a horrible job on the economy, and that's why he got removed from office. And so that kind of fills in our financing. Growth in finances, he's not going to get very good rankings. He didn't do a very good job. International politics is usually what people point to when they say, okay, yeah, Nixon was bad about this, but in terms of international politics, he was great. So let me start with the positives. I don't agree with that assessment, just as a spoiler. I don't think Nixon was particularly great in terms of international politics. I don't think he was atrocious, but I think we're also doing this as a comparison to other United States presidents, and most United States presidents actually do a pretty good job in terms of foreign relations. As I've been going through the survey and looking at each of them one by one, that's one of the things that's been interesting to me is there are very few presidents that I'm like, oh, you really did a horrible job in terms of international politics. Maybe it's because of how the United States is removed. But most of the presidents, relative to especially other leaders in other countries, I think did a pretty decent job in terms of international politics. Nixon did not. But on the positives, first thing everyone else points to is Nixon going to China. And like, oh, Nixon went to China, Nixon went to China. I think reopening connections with China and the detente we kind of got into with the Soviet Union, those are very positive things. I do not want to take those things away from Nixon when we're having this conversation. They were positive. But I think that they get overstated because I think there was an assumption when Nixon came in that Nixon was so anti-communist that anything he did with regards to these regimes was just remarkable, and he gets too much credit for it because, no, it was unexpected. And I don't think they offset the horrible things he did in other places. Obviously, we can talk about the Vietnam War. And when you talk about the Vietnam War, you then talk about the expansion into Laos and Cambodia and the massive bombing war crime campaign, no other way to really describe it, that led to not only Vietnam eventually collapsing and Saigon falling shortly after Nixon left office, if I remember correctly on the time frame, and then the Saigon, it's just all of that's horrible. But now you also destabilized Cambodia and Laos. Cambodia eventually leading to Pol Pot and the killing fields and the Cambodian genocide. Again, not 100% all on Nixon. Everyone has agency in their own country, but certainly in Nixon's pocket of destabilizing the region that he's supposed to be keeping the authoritarian regimes and the communist regimes from taking power, and instead he's giving them impetus and really creating the environment that allows it to happen. In a different way, the support of the coup in Chile and Pinochet, putting a horrible tyrannical dictator in power, although giving it Chile agency, but we definitely created the circumstances that allowed that to occur. India could have been a great ally. Our relations are still tenuous with them because of our relationship with Pakistan that was established during this time, and India getting a nuclear weapon while we're having this conflict with them because we weren't able to negotiate with them because we had become so mad about our support of Pakistan because we were trying to become friendly with China. That still is a tense factor even to this day. Do I think Nixon doctrine is probably better than the doctrine that came before? I think it's different. I think saying instead of sending troops, we're going to send weapons is less direct involvement from the United States in terms of troops on the ground, but it's not necessarily less involvement in terms of creating conflict around the world. In some ways, it's kind of worse because there's no reason for us to stop. It now becomes a profit margin process where people are dying, where we have no skin in the game. We're just making money as arms dealers. Is it better to be an arms dealer than to send troops? I don't know. And that's kind of how I read the Nixon document. It's like, let's just become arms dealers. And a lot of those arms will eventually fall into the hands of people we don't want to have them for lots of reasons. But we'll get to that later with another president. Spoilers we'll get to later of how sending arms can be quite problematic. I don't think any of that was particularly great. Now, again, do I think Nixon was awful in international politics? No, I don't think he was awful. I just think he's significantly overpraised. I don't think he did a particularly good job in terms of international politics, and I don't understand. Well, I understand why he gets the praise because the expectations were so low with him regards to Soviet Union and China. And it is very serious that it is very important that we had a detente and some softening relations in the SALT Treaty. All of that's very good. But I don't think that gives him a pass for any of the other stuff he did. Kissinger was a horrible, horrible, horrible person on so many levels. But I'll just let that slide. Because let's move on to war and security, the Vietnam War. And also just general crime going up. Crime was very high in the 70s. Domestic instability. I don't think the Nixon era was a particularly great time to be alive on a lot of levels in the United States. I think it got significantly worse. And he used effectively scapegoating and finger pointing and blaming all of these different people. And I think that made him able to win the re-election in 1972 because he had lots of scapegoats on the left. And he was very good at turning everybody against each other and pointing the finger in other directions. But I don't think the country was particularly well run. I think people just got tired of it by 1974. And I think that's why Watergate took him out. And when people get tired of your presidency to the point that you have to resign in shame, I think it's pretty fair to say on the better or worse scale, you're going to fall on the worst side, pretty low. But how low? He's not going to be at the very bottom. He's not Buchanan leaving the Civil War. I don't think he's Hoover leaving the Great Depression. Or Andrew Johnson and Talyor level incompetence. Andrew Johnson level of allowing Reconstruction to fail, or allowing the Ku Klux Klan to become mighty enough to have to become a terrorist group within the United States. He's not on that level. I think I'm going to put him above Franklin Pierce because I do think Bleeding Kansas is worse than anything that happened under Nixon. And that puts him, I think that's as far up as I'm going to bring him because I think I'm going to put him below Millard Fillmore at number 31. Nixon was not a very good president, and I think that was shown by the fact that no one wanted to be president anymore, and a scandal as weak as Watergate could lead people to just say, let's just take this and make him go home.